you. Very nice. Thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, I was assigned this task by Ajit. I don't know for what reason. He wanted me to talk about uniquely human features of female reproductive biology. And there, of course, are very many. There is a very large list that Ajit many years ago compiled. And I want to talk here only about 4 of these for this afternoon, if I get through with this. That is preeclampsia, a common condition in humans, twinning, or the mechanism by which we have multiple reproduction, early fetal wastage, which is very high in humans and of which we know relatively little in non-human primates, and ectopic pregnancy, or more specifically endometriosis. Preeclampsia is my first topic. About 5 to 7% of pregnancies in human hospitals or in human biology suffer from preeclampsia. It's a condition that's primarily expressed in young women in first pregnancies. It is occasionally recurrent, not very often recurrent, and it eventuates occasionally in eclampsia, which is a separate condition. Then there's multiple pregnancy in humans. In our midst, we have about 1 in 80 pregnancies that result in twins, rarely in triplets or quadruplets, but the incidence has markedly increased in the last few years because of ART, the artificial reproductive technology, assisted reproductive technology that has led to an enormous increase in this. Chromosomal errors in humans is very common as a cause of spontaneous abortions, but we know very little about spontaneous abortions in primates and non-human primates, and there are a few studies that I want to refer to. Finally, endometriosis, while it is common in cercopithecids, it's an interesting condition that we need to talk about. Preeclampsia, pregnancy-induced hypertension, or toxemia of pregnancy. We refer to it as obstetricians and pathologists in our hospital. It's about 5 to 7% in human hospitals in this country, and it appears to be totally unique to human pregnancies. At least there are no good descriptions of this disease or this condition in non-human primates. It leads to growth-restricted babies very commonly. It is a disease for which there is no good hypothesis, at least none that has been accepted by the public as being the mechanism by which this disease comes about. We don't know it, basically. It occasionally leads to eclampsia, that is the condition that is associated with preeclampsia and is associated with convulsions. Preeclampsia is a condition that is characterized by proteinuria, that is urine containing protein, edema, largely of the legs, but often also of the face, and hypertension in pregnancy. Now, that's a difficult constellation for any one of us to ascertain. Say, if you worked in the zoo and are interested in, do chimpanzees, when they get pregnant, or bonobos and gorillas, do they have preeclampsia? Because we can't ask them to give us their arm and measure their hypertension. There are no studies where implanted blood pressure measurements have been made of animals. We occasionally collect the urine for endocrine studies of some pregnant bonobos or gorillas, and actually one gorilla who eventually had a baby that was a stillborn did have proteinuria, but we have nothing to say about the hypertension or the edema, because edema is, again, very difficult to ascertain in non-human primates. The HELP syndrome is a very unusual, but not all that infrequent condition, actually, in human pregnancies, and we see it maybe 4 or 5 times a year in our hospital, where we have about 4,000 or so deliveries. It's associated with hemolytic anemia and elevated liver enzymes and low blood platelet counts, and proteinuria, of course. There are a number of theories that have been explored, and as I was telling the student that sits next to me, there is a plaque at the Chicago Lying-In Hospital where there are the originators of major discoveries in obstetrics and gynecology, but the plaque for preeclampsia is empty because we don't know what causes it. There is Semmelweis and all kinds of other people on other plaques, but the one for preeclampsia is empty. There are a number of theories that have been explored because we see it so often in multiple pregnancy, or more often in multiple pregnancies, and associated with toxemia with hydatidiform moles, which is a huge mass of placental tissue. It's been suggested that it is, in fact, a reaction against too much trophoblast in the placenta presentation. And that leads to an immunological hypothesis that the mother sees for the first time all this placenta that expresses paternal antigens and is trying to immunologically react against this invader, if you wish. And therefore, when she has her second pregnancy, she's already used to it, and she has accommodated herself to it. Well, it is strengthened by the fact that actually when she gets a new husband, the disease may reappear. So there's a possibility that this is an immunological expression. It is associated with placental ischemia for reasons that I will come to in a second. There are genetic causes that have been explored. There are theories on prostaglandins, and currently, most prominently, it is suggested that this is a reaction against endothelial vascular structures in the placenta. Now, the placenta in preeclampsia is very characteristic. This is a placental injection specimen here on the right side, in which the fetal circulation is injected with white plastic, and this is the maternal arteriole, and you can see that the individual cotyledons are perfused by a single spiral arteriole that goes into the intervillous space between all of these branches of the villus trees, and that it is returned in the veins into the uterus of the mother. Now, the arteries are invaded by trophoblast, and this is trophoblast here. This is the endometrial floor of the placenta. If you were to look at this, what I'm showing you here is this blood vessel here that is being invaded normally by this trophoblast here. This is extravillus trophoblast, as we call it, and it alters the wall of the normal spiral arteriole that perfuses the placenta normally in such a manner as to make out of it a stiff tube, if you wish, so that if the mother gets to be excited or whatever changes her blood pressure, that the perfusion through the villus tissue in the intervillus space here is guaranteed, so that this wall remains as a compliant vessel that does not react to maternal circumstances. Now, in toxemia of pregnancy, that doesn't happen. And for reasons we have no clue why this is happening, the wall of this arteriole that you see here is altered in such a fashion that it is not replaced and made into a stiff tube, but that it is actually altered in such a fashion that there are macrophages that collect cholesterol infiltrating, and as a consequence there is constriction, and there's very often thrombosis of these blood vessels, and as a result of this there are all these infarcts which are dead placental tissue, and as a result of which the baby does not grow properly. It is growth restricted, and it is frequently delivered by cesarean section. It may also die. It may die because there is an abruptio placentae. There is thrombosis here, whereby then the placental tissue behind it bleeds. There is an abruption of placental tissue, and when more than say 30 or 40% of the placenta suddenly detaches itself from this perfusional system, then the baby dies, and there is nothing that can be done about it. And for that reason, this is of great interest to us in biology. Now, unfortunately, we have never seen this in primates. We see infarcts, single infarcts, very often in many primate placentas, particularly cercopithecus. Every baboon, every rhesus monkey that delivers has some of these small infarcts, but none of these lesions associated with it, nor is it known whether or not these animals have hypertension or any of the other symptoms of preeclampsia. So we think that this is a truly human condition that does not exist in any pre-hominid, and in the very rare placenta that we get from a chimpanzee. This is actually a chimpanzee blood vessel here in the floor of the placenta. It is perfectly normally constructed. Dr. Shays, many years ago, suggested that it does not exist in non-human primates, but Chaylin in a recent paper has suggested that PIH arose because of an accommodation of the trophoblast to become invasive, and that it was needed for the changes in the bow plan of the embryo. And I don't understand the paper, but you can read it for yourself. It's advertised there. It's an interesting problem that remains to be resolved. Okay, that's preeclampsia. Multiple pregnancy is a condition that occurs in roughly 1 in 80 pregnancies in this country as a set of twins, but it's very uncommon in Japan, for instance, and very common in Nigeria. The Yoruba tribe has 1 in 20 or so pregnancies is a set of twins, and frequently they are triplets. And the reason for that is difficult to understand. So for that reason, many years ago, I imported from Japan and from Nigeria the blood samples of ordinary people, women, and determined the FSH, the amount of follicle-stimulating hormone that is produced by the pituitary in these women, and it is necessary for the ovulation of 1 egg or 2 eggs or 3 eggs in a woman, and it is very high in the Yoruba tribe. It is very low in the Japanese, and we're sort of in the middle. Moreover, in aging women, in women who are over 35 or so, the incidence of twinning goes significantly up. So we think it's primarily FSH and LH levels. But there is a very recent interesting suggestion that it may be related to IGF-1 in the diet. And that relates largely to our understanding of Japanese who've come to America and have become incorporated into the American diets. They have very low frequency of FSH levels in Japan, but their twinning rate goes up when they have lived in San Francisco for many years, and when their diet has undergone major changes. In fact, there are some interesting studies in cattle where the IGF-1 production regulates the amount of FSH in the cattle industry, and the milk production. And it is presumed, oh my God, you must be out of your mind. You talk too long. Yeah, you talk too long. Anyway, it's very much more common now in our country. And there are two types of twins, and there are really fascinating problems associated with the twinning. There are identical twins, monozygotic twins, and there are fraternal twins. Fraternal twins make up 2/3 of our population. 1/3 is identical twins. And identical twins in this placenta, for instance, have very frequently anastomoses in the surface of the placenta between the two fetal circulations of these placentas. There are also all kinds of other abnormalities associated with the single umbilical artery, for instance, or abnormal chromosome constitutions in these placentas. In any event, it is very uncommon in non-human primates. It has been described in the Yerkes Primate Center many years ago in a few families of chimpanzees, but largely we know nothing about the inheritance of twins in non-human primates. There are a few twins that have been identified, as you can see here, in chimpanzee maternities. But then there is a group of animals, the South American marmoset and tamarin monkeys always have fraternal twins, and they are always associated with anastomosis between the two circulations, and they're all chimeras for that reason. The very last thing that I want to say here is related to ectopic pregnancies. The reason why we don't see ectopic pregnancies in non-human primates presumably is due to the fact that they suffer very rarely from fallopian tube disease, from the obstruction of fallopian tubes, because very few of them carry any of the common antigens, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and so on, infections that cause the obstruction of the fallopian tubes through which the embryo has to pass. The sperm can go up, the embryo gets fertilized, but it gets stuck in the fallopian tube, becomes an ectopic pregnancy. On the other hand, endometriosis is very common in primates. Endometriosis is the presence of endometrium growing in the peritoneal cavity or on the surface of the fallopian tube. It is very common in non-human primates, particularly in rhesus monkeys, and it often embolizes actually to the lung of such animals. This is endometrium growing in the lung of a term animal that died from this disease and the bleeding into the lung. I'm so sorry I can't talk about anything else because he pushes me off. I thank you very much.